everyone, my name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be discussing my personal recommendations for getting started with rules and power exchange in a BDSM dynamic. Rules and punishments are probably the two things that I get asked the most questions about on my channel. And if you are looking for those resources, I have lots of other videos covering how to establish a power exchange dynamic, how to negotiate, punishment ideas, reward systems, all of those things. So if you want to learn more about those as well, please do remember to check out the videos that will be in the description box below so you can have that additional knowledge. Today, specifically what I want to talk about are my personal general guidelines that I use when I'm evaluating if this is a rule that I want to have part of my BDSM dynamic. And then I'm also going to be giving you guys 5 recommendations to start off with rules in your own relationship, which I find are particularly helpful if you don't really know what you want out of power exchange yet, or are nervous and don't yet have any experience. So, like I said, the first thing that I want to talk about are my general guidelines I use when I'm evaluating if I want to have rules or a certain role in my dynamic. And the first thing that is probably always top of my mind is purpose. Purpose is so important. Why are you doing this role? Why do you want this? Is it because it fulfills a kink need? Is it about reinforcing the dynamic? Is it about feeling closer to your submissive side? Is it about personal growth or learning a skill or remembering to do a healthy habit? There are lots of reasons why you could potentially want to add a certain rule to a relationship. However, I would avoid things like I don't know, or because everybody else is doing it, or because this is what we should do as a dom and a sub. I just don't personally agree with that. Now, you may not necessarily have solid reasons when you're first getting into it and you are in that experimental phase, but then, hey, it's because you want to experiment. It should be something where you're talking to your partner, figuring out what purpose does this serve, because rules that don't really have any meaning behind them and that aren't fulfilling are going to be difficult to remember, they're going to be hard to enforce, and more often than not, they're eventually going to end up on the wayside of the relationship, and ultimately that could end up damaging your ability to continue to do additional power exchange in the future when one party isn't remembering and the other one isn't remembering to enforce it. As well, I always recommend starting off slowly. I think there's this misconception online that people get from trying to look up resources about rules that gives people the idea that everybody starts off with like this thick rule book of all of these very detailed, exacting things that are expected of the submissive, and whenever you enter into a power exchange dynamic, you automatically get this rule book and you're going to start doing it tomorrow. And there are sometimes people who enter into relationships that way, but I think if you're new, the best way to set yourself up with success is not to walk into everything with 20 rules, but to take things in baby steps. Do it one thing at a time. So I recommend starting off with just 1 or 2 rules at first. Get kind of a sense for them. Try them on, if you will. Figure out if they work for your dynamic or not, how you can adjust them. Almost sort of have like a trial period. Then when you feel comfortable with those, you start adding more. Or maybe you go back and you try out a different rule. But you can eventually get to the place where you have that thick stack of rules, but it should ideally start off 1 rule at a time. Because when you're new, you don't really necessarily know what you want yet. The idea of a certain rule can be very different from the reality of it. Having to live with a certain rule every single day is different than the fantasy picture of it that you have in your head. Which brings me to my next point, which is always negotiate while sober. And this goes for like all of BDSM, but especially when it comes to coming up with rules, I do not recommend you add new rules or negotiate to add something to your dynamic mid-scene, or when you're in subspace, or when you are in aftercare, or when you're high. If you're in some kind of altered state of mind, that is not the best place to be adding new rules to the relationship. The phrase that I've often heard in my local community is, don't negotiate when you're horny. Because especially when you're horny, just like all those other altered states of mind, your brain is flooded with chemicals that is making it choose things that your everyday self may not normally have chosen. And something that sounds really, really hot when you're deep in subspace may not be so hot to you when you're not in subspace. And if not subspace you has to deal with that thing for however long the rule is in place for, that can end up not feeling very good. So if you do have an idea that comes up when you're horny or you're in a scene, save it until after all of those things have kind of been cleared out of the system. Give yourself space and time to kind of really think about, is this something that I want to commit myself to before you go into that? Because rules can definitely be hot, they can be really engaging and bonding to the dynamic, but if you're actively going into these and instantly getting horny when you're talking about them, that is maybe not necessarily the best place to come to rational, long-term, healthy decisions. As well, when you're coming up with rules, I recommend you keep things simple. Going back to the whole giant rule book of rules thing, things don't really have to be that complicated. I know there is an allure to plan things to absolute death, be super, super exacting in everything, and there is value to that, and there are times and situations where you should be anticipating things that might get in the way or cause misinterpretation of a specific rule, but when you're starting out, it is good to have that flexibility rather than rigidity, because basically what you're doing is you're taking like a lump of clay, and you're building that clay with your partner, and you're deciding ultimately what shape is this going to take. And maybe you decide that you want to make a vase. Well, you should probably leave some room for interpretation about what ultimately the shape of the vase is going to be and how big it's going to be, or how wide it is, or how big the opening is. There are many, many variations on the way that you can get to the ultimate final thing that you want to be doing. And the less rigidity you have, the more ability you have to make accommodations, to make changes without it being damaging to the relationship. And the last thing is to remember to communicate with your partner. This is so important in pretty much all areas of BDSM. I can't really think of a time when it's not, but especially when you're coming up with rules. I know if you're new, if you are submissive, if you're just getting into this, it is really tempting to stay silent if something is not working for you, particularly if you think it's a simple rule or an easy rule. If you're having trouble remembering it, if it's difficult for you to keep up with because of your school schedule or work, or for some reason you're just dealing with a bad spot and you're not really able to kind of get in the mood to do it, whatever it is, it doesn't necessarily mean that the rule shouldn't be in place, but what should happen is an opportunity to talk to your partner about why something isn't working the way that you expected, and how things can change or not change, or what your partner can do to help you. And this definitely goes for dominance as well. Like dominance, if you are feeling uncomfortable with a certain rule, if you are having trouble remembering enforcing the rules, or you're having difficulty like mentally thinking about enforcing something or getting into that headspace, like talk to your partner about that too. No matter where you are in the slash, no matter if you're giving or receiving the rules, there should always be that opportunity to talk about how things are working, revisiting subjects, and it's not a failure to have to get rid of a rule or rework something. This is all a growth process. This is all about learning, and remember to give yourselves those opportunities to learn. Alright, now I'm going to go ahead and get into my 5 rule recommendations I have if you are just getting started with rules in BDSM. I tried to make these as versatile as possible because again, these are just simple ideas, but they're ones that I think work pretty well no matter what sort of dynamic you're hoping to get into, pet play or CGL or general MS, whatever it is. These are some pretty good places to start. My number 1 recommendation is setting bedtimes and or having a no technology immediately before bed rule. I think this one has a pretty clear purpose. It's about establishing healthy things in your submissive's life. It is about having a routine and a schedule, and many, many rules are built on a foundation of schedules, and there's no better place to start that than with the time that the person goes to sleep. It's something that's really easy to enforce, especially if you live with the person, and even if you don't, it's something that is easy to send reminders about, set alarms for. There's all kinds of ways where you can make sure that this is going to be a rule that is kept in place. And I think ultimately when somebody starts to see the positive benefits of a rule like this, it's almost something that becomes self-enforcing and then can start to build on itself. My second recommendation is good morning / good night messages. Again, very, very clear purpose. It's about keeping your partnership and keeping your BDSM dynamic in mind, even when you aren't necessarily with each other. It's something that is very flexible between different work schedules and different sleep schedules and time zones and long distance relationships, and even if you live with your partner, you can do this. So very flexible, and it is so easy to do. If you are somebody who's really busy, it literally takes you, 4 seconds after you get out of the shower in the morning or when you're first waking up and you're checking Facebook anyway. Just send your partner a quick message and say, "Good morning, sir," and they can say, "Good morning, little one," or whatever it is. Text, email, a phone call, whatever works best for your particular situation. I think this is a great way to, again, keep the power exchange dynamic in mind, and especially for those of us who are interested in CGL or pet play, who tend to be a little bit more focused on wanting attention in the relationship. Just having these quick little kind of openers and closers to the day can make us feel so much more important to our partners, even if we're not really able to have a lot of in-depth communication throughout the rest of the day. And that also leads me into my third suggestion, which is title protocols. I think that sounds a little bit more intense than it really is, but basically what it means is that you and your partner come to an agreement to always use certain titles with each other. So maybe you always call your partner little one, and they always call you daddy or sir. And that is how they are expected to address you. And if they call you by another name, like your real name or your full name, or they forget to add in, the sir or the ma'am or whatever it happens to be, then they've broken the rule. This is something that, again, has a clear purpose of establishing the relationship dynamic, of enforcing it on a daily basis, and it's a pretty easy habit to get into. There's a couple different ways you can do this. Like for me, I always call my partner sir whenever I'm referring to him, unless I am around like vanilla people or I don't want to have somebody be involved in our dynamic. But you can also do this where you have somebody always use the person's title at the end of their sentences when they're communicating. So, "Yes, sir," or "I've had a good morning, sir," or "What have you had for breakfast, sir?" Whatever it happens to be, you can have these ways to make sure that title gets inserted in regular periods throughout the day to, again, reinforce that dynamic and reinforce the power exchange. And my fourth recommendation is keeping track of your submissive's drinking water. Now, in general, I'm not a really big proponent of rules and punishments based around diet, because it can definitely be a very, very slippery slope and a way to help somebody harm themselves. But I think comparatively, keeping track of something like water is a little bit lower risk. It's less likely to have a lot of potential ramifications to it. The biggest issue with keeping track of water is how you actually do it, and the amount obviously is going to vary person to person and body type to body type. I know some people who do this by sending a photo every single time they drink a glass of water, but depending on your everyday environment and what your life is typically like, it can be so easy to forget to take a photo when you're busy with family or kids, you're at like a busy nightclub or something, and if your partner is suddenly getting 10 photos of water glasses all the time, it can really impede the rest of the conversation you're having, and it can get difficult for them to keep track of as well. There are lots of water intake tracking apps that you can use on your cell phone, and it can be something where you send screenshots to your partner so they can see how much water you're drinking. They can physically check it once a week, or maybe they can even be part of the app as well so they can see, and maybe they can even track their own water intake, have sort of some mutual accountability. But overall, I think this is a good starter rule, particularly if you are wanting to have rules that are more like health and fitness focused before you completely go down that pathway. My last recommendation, number 5, is asking permission. This one is very, very general, but that is on purpose. I think the habit of learning to ask permission for something specific is a great way of keeping the submissive mindset going. It's a great way of putting the dominant in a position of power. It's a great way for them to get used to being the one who is making decisions and in a constant position of authority. And it is very flexible to different interests and things that you want to get into. This could be things like asking permission to get on the couch if you're a pet player, asking permission to use the restroom if you're a little, asking permission to leave a room if you're service focused, asking to be dismissed at dinner, all sorts of things, asking permission to get into bed, asking permission to have an orgasm. so many ways to incorporate this rule into so many different dynamics, and it is so buildable as well, because once you involve having to ask permission for one thing, it becomes a lot easier to get into the habit to be able to do that with other things as well. Alright, that is all the suggestions I have for today. Hopefully you found these interesting and helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know down in the comment section below. Let me know if you liked this video, and if you did, make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. I make videos twice a week, and if you want to support my channel, the best way you can do that is over on Patreon. That is how I'm able to make these videos and make lots of exclusive bonus content if that interests you. And until I see you guys next time, have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.